Welcome, everyone. I am Scott Black, Director of the Tanner Humanities Center, and I'm delighted to welcome you to our Tanner conversation with Paul Reeve and Christopher Rich about their book, co-written with Regine Purcell Carew, This Abominable Slavery, Race, Religion, and the Battle Over Human Bondage in Antebellum, Utah. Paul Reeve is Simmons Chair of Mormon Studies at the University of Utah and currently chair of the History Department. He is author most recently of Religion of a Different Color, Race in the Mormon Struggle for Whiteness, and Let's Talk About Race and Priesthood. He is also general editor of the database, Century of Black Mormons, which is designed to identify all known Black Latter-day Saints baptized into the faith between 1830 and 1930. Christopher Rich is currently a PhD student in history at the University of Utah. He is trained as a lawyer and serves in the Army JAG Corps and has a new position, but I didn't write it down. Congratulations on the new position. They are joined by Alice Faulkner Burch, Director of Special Events at the Sima Hadithi African American Heritage and Culture Foundation. She is editor of My Lord He Calls You, Stories of Faith by Black American Latter-day Saints, and by Jordan Watkins, Associate Professor of Church History and Doctrine at BYU. He is author of Slavery and Sacred Texts, the Bible, the Constitution, and Antebellum Historical Consciousness, and is editor of a volume in the document series of the Joseph Smith Papers. This Tanner conversation has two faces. It is part of our series featuring new works of scholarship by faculty in the College of Humanities, and it is part of the Tanner Humanities Center's renewed partnership with the Mormon Studies Initiative at the University of Utah, which is directed by Paul Reeve. The Tanner is delighted to work with Dr. Reeve to help foster the best scholarship and community programming in Mormon studies. We understand that the study of religions and faith traditions is an integral part of the humanities because they are central to our lives, our history, and our culture. We are grateful to our supporters, the O.C. Tanner Company, Salt Lake Arts Council, Salt Lake Zoo Arts and Parks, Utah Humanities, the King's English Bookshop, which is selling books out front afterwards, and our supporters who become friends of the Tanner. We are committed to keeping our public programming freely available to the community, but we can only do that with your support. If you are able to make a contribution, please consider becoming a friend of the Tanner Humanities Center by visiting our website, tanner.utah.edu. Thank you for your support. And finally, many thanks to our excellent Tanner staff, Beth James and Robert Carson, who make this event and all our events possible. Now, please join me in welcoming our authors and panelists.
So thank you to Scott and to the Tanner Humanities Center for hosting this. I'm going to start by simply telling the book's origin story and some of the big picture questions that we sought to answer. And then Jordan will give the Brigham Young University response. And then we will have a conversation that Jordan will direct. So this book started with the Ask Us tab at the Church History Library of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. I submitted a question that simply said, is there a Pittman shorthand version of a Brigham Young speech for 5th of January or 5th of February, 1852? I knew enough to know that there were Pittman recorders, a 19th century version of shorthand that would record speeches. Scholars were unsure of the origins of the Latter-day Saint racial priesthood restrictions. I narrowed it down to a couple of speeches that originated in 1852. I received a response back. They didn't have a Pittman version for a 5th of January speech, but the response didn't address the 5th of February speech. In the meantime, I had Christopher Rich read a draft of the chapter I was working on for Religion of a Different Color. He's a legal scholar, and I was interested in his feedback on this particular chapter. He said, I really think that speech is the 5th of February speech, which prompted me to submit a second question, just addressing the 5th of February, 1852 speech. So the answer came back, not only is there a Pittman shorthand version of Brigham Young's speech on that day, but there's an entire folder in the George Watt collection that has not been transcribed. It was captured in Pittman shorthand in 1852. Watt's typical method is to then transcribe his own work into longhand, and it would get published in the Deseret News or the Journal of Discourses. This particular folder from the 1852 legislative session sat in his collection from 1852 until 2013, when Legene Purcell Carruth, the Pittman shorthand expert at the LDS Church History Department, transcribed those speeches. So this book is based upon a flood of new evidence that no prior scholar had access to. Roughly 60 pages of typed transcript speeches. And then we obviously scoured state archives and local archives, roughly 200 pages of primary sources, a document collection that is now publicly available at thisabominableslavery.org, a website hosted by the University of Utah, where all of those speeches are publicly available and open access. This Abominable Slavery, the book, is our attempt at interpreting that evidence, writing a narrative history for the first time. So really the central question that we attempt to answer in this book is the question that is roiling the nation in the 1850s. Can human beings be held as property? That question will ultimately cost the nation 600,000 lives. Northerners suggest that that human beings can't be held as property. That's a fundamental violation of the founding principles of this nation. Southerners suggest that the Constitution, in fact, protects property rights, and therefore trying to strip them of their human beings as property is a violation of the Constitution. What we see then is Utah Territory attempting to answer that same question, the question that will ultimately end in a civil war. So what we attempt to do in the book is just simply offer what the legislators believed they were passing. What are the legal answers to that question? They write an act in relation to service to govern the legal relationship between white enslavers and their black enslaved. And they write an act for the further relief of Indian slaves and prisoners to govern the relationship between those who bring Native children into their homes, purchase them from youth traffickers. What legal relationship will govern those, what they eventually pass is an indenture bill. So the indenture of Native children. So we attempt to address what those laws meant for the legislators. And then also what those laws meant in the lives of those who were African American and Native American enslaved in Utah Territory. That's the more difficult question to answer because you don't have written evidence from the perspective of those who are enslaved. But we have a chapter called Implications of how these laws played out in practice. So we try to answer it from the perspective of the white male legislators, as well as from the perspective of those who these laws were meant to govern. We also then focus in on a debate taking place between Orson Pratt and Brigham Young. And you have the mixing of roles taking place in this legislative session. So the subtitle is Race, Religion, and Battle Over Human Bondage. Brigham Young is territorial governor and president of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Orson Pratt is territorial legislator and apostle in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And religion gets mixed heavily with politics in this legislative session. And so there are theological implications as well as political implications from this legislative session, and we attempt to address that. One of the conclusions that we arrive at is simply that Brigham Young and other legislators are looking backward to the various unfree labor categories in operation in the 19th century that they were familiar with when they came of age in this nation. Orson Pratt, in contrast, represents the free labor ethic sweeping in across the nation. So you have those cross currents that are playing out politically in national politics, playing out in Utah politics at the same time. That's a big picture overview of what we attempted to do in the book, and Jordan will now give us his response.
Thanks to Scott and Paul for inviting me to participate in this conversation. I really appreciate it. I have read the book twice now, and I can highly recommend it. There's much to commend about this book. It features the fruits of Legene Caruth's transcriptions of sources recorded in Pittman shorthand, Christopher Rich's careful analysis of laws and legal documents, and Paul Reeve's hallmark attentiveness to the development of racial attitudes. Their combined efforts have yielded a clear narrative and cogent analysis. The authors confront a set of binaries that often frame our understanding of pre-Civil War America, including freedom, slavery, North, South, and pro-slavery, anti-slavery. Scholars have shown these binaries to be flimsy, but rarely does a single monograph overturn them all. This book does so in several ways. First, the authors reveal the gradations of unfreedom that existed in antebellum America. Second, they demonstrate that enslavement was a feature of the West and show that debates over slavery and labor followed immigrants to new Western states and territories. And third, they focus on figures who took middling positions on slavery. The authors achieve all this by analyzing an overlooked episode in American history. While little has been written about the Service Act, and I will focus my comments on the legislation passed to govern relationships between white enslavers and black enslaved people, little has been written about the Service Act, but some have assumed that the law was a slave code. The authors correct this perception. Their comparative analysis of antecedent and contemporaneous legal developments show that the Act had more in common with indenture laws and gradual emancipation laws than with slave codes. As they demonstrate, the Act did not make servitude heritable. Furthermore, the authors highlight provisions that granted bound people consent, as in Section 7, which stipulated that masters could not sell a servant without his or her authorization, and Section 8, which specified that masters could not remove a servant from the territory contrary to his or her will. Such provisions contrast with the logic of Southern slave codes, which reserved consent for white enslavers and authorities. While I was persuaded by this main argument, I found myself questioning some of the particulars. At times, the author seemed to make narrow use of prior legal developments. In 1818, Illinois passed a law that allowed enslavers to place formerly enslaved people in long-term indentureships. According to the authors, most contemporaries believe that this law established involuntary servitude. In other words, in the opinion of many, the principle of consent was nominal and certainly not fundamental to that law. However, when the authors turn attention to Utah's 1852 Act, they recall this context to contend that the principle of consent was at the heart of the law. When analyzing the last clause of Section 3, which stipulates, "It shall appear that servants came into the territory of their own free will and choice," the authors contend that this prerequisite was not merely cosmetic. As noted, a limited form of consent does feature prominently in sections of the Act, though its application here seems contextually and perhaps infratextually dubious. The author suggests as much in granting that the bill did not specify how consent was to be proven. If consent was at the heart of the law, one might expect it to provide a mechanism to ensure that an enslaved person had chosen to come to the territory. The author's analysis of the implications of the act also raises questions about the priority of the principle of consent. There are no extant records showing that masters obtain the consent of bound people to bring them into the territory, remove them from the territory, or sell them to another master. While the evidence related to the enforcement of the act is slight, the author's analysis makes it clear that the act was applied haphazardly and that provisions meant to protect bound people could be and sometimes were ignored. In this and other ways, the Service Act can be compared to slave codes. Sections 5 and 9 require that masters house, clothe, feed, and educate their servants, while Section 6 stipulates that if masters fail to do this, or if they unreasonably punish servants, a probate judge may annul the contract. Similar language also appeared in some slave codes, including Georgia statutes that outlawed cruel treatment and the failure to provide food and clothing. Now, such laws had more to do with protecting valuable property than with a concern for bound people, and they were rarely enforced. But this contextual information might shed some light on the motivations and intent of those who created and passed the Service Act. The authors demonstrate that paternalism shaped indenture laws, but paternalism also informed the slaveholding mentality. I am not suggesting that the Service Act was, after all, a slave code. I am noting that the Act has some similarities to slave codes, and proposing that some of the same sentiments that animated those codes may have animated Northern indenture laws and the Utah Service Act. This relates to another of the author's contentions, that far from unequivocally favoring chattel slavery, Brigham Young was fundamentally opposed to property in man. On this score, the authors are again persuasive, though not conclusively so. They highlight Young's statements in favor of free labor and against property in man, demonstrate that the Service Act aligned with his somewhat moderate views, and point to a few instances in which he secured the freedom of bound individuals and encouraged practices that aligned with the Service Act. In weighing these statements and actions against contradictory ones, the authors find the scales tilting in an anti-slavery direction. At least once, they refer to Young's anti-slavery instincts. Young clearly inhabited a space somewhere in the messy middle, but in my reading of the evidence, his opposition to property in man was more general than fundamental and more moldable than fixed. He may have opposed chattel slavery, but on what grounds? In 1860, Young had his secretary read Hinton Helper's Impending Crisis of the South, a widely read book by a Southerner who argued that slavery was an impediment to economic progress. Helper was less concerned with the well-being of enslaved Black people than he was for that of white Southerners. Young agreed with Helper's principal conclusion, noting, "I do not want labor performed by slaves. They would impoverish me." Economic considerations also informed Young's approach to freeing bound Black people, as in 1861, when he told Doritha Lewis that if she wanted to sell Jerry at a sufficiently moderate price, Young might purchase him and set him at liberty. It seems that Young approached emancipation and the enforcement of the Service Act not as a moral imperative, but instead on a case-by-case basis and in relationship to considerations of economics and governance. This relates to the author's comparison between Young and moderate anti-slavery Protestants. In some ways, this alignment works well. Moderates comprised a broad range of individuals, from Unitarian William Channing, who embraced immediatism before his death in 1842, to Congregationalist Moses Stewart, who defended the Fugitive Slave Law in 1850. Moderates generally encouraged conservative approaches to emancipation, and many of them exhibited a paternalistic racism similar to that found in Young's speeches. However, moderates also believed that slavery was a sin. They granted that God had permitted slavery anciently, but believed that the sin of slaveholding had become clear in relationship to moral progress. Some of them, like Channing, rejected biblical arguments and moved in the direction of abolitionism. Young did not, nor is it clear to me that he viewed chattel slavery as a sin. Young interpreted the Civil War not as God's punishment for slavery, but as retribution for the Latter-day Saints' persecution. In 1863, he chastised both abolitionists and slaveholders, and noted, and the authors talk about this quote in the text, that if forced to choose, he should certainly be against the pro-slavery side. But this had little to do with slavery and everything to do with the fact that it was pro-slavery men that pointed the bayonet at he and his brethren in Missouri. About a year later, Young again criticized Southerners who mobbed us in Missouri, even as he also countered the anti-slavery claim that slaveholding was a sin. God does not care one farthing about a man, where he is brought up, whether he owns slaves or not. If he owns them, Young stated, walk uprightly before God. Focused on his own people, Young seemed indifferent about Southern slavery's fate and prayed that both the North and the South would be whipped. Personal experiences and the saints' circumstances, more than a fundamental religious opposition to property in man, appear to have shaped Young's approach to slavery. Now, I hope you've noticed that my critique of this book is rather minor, narrow, and laced with praise. I simply have questions about parts of the author's analysis of the Service Act and portions of their characterization of Young, but I am persuaded by their core arguments. In surfacing, transcribing, contextualizing, and analyzing overlooked historical documents, the authors have crafted a book with all the characteristics of the best kind of historical analysis. They have challenged persistent binaries, broadened, deepened, and clarified our understanding of overlooked developments, and provoked further scholarly debate. Finally, this abominable slavery reminds us of several important historical lessons, of which I'll just mention two. First, it demonstrates that, in James Baldwin's phrase, the story of a people is never very pretty. This general observation gains power through the kind of specificity provided by Rich, Reeve, and Caruth. That specificity leads to my final point. In Colson Whitehead's Nickel Boys, Turner, one of the central characters, thinks to himself, the law was one thing. You can change the law, but you can't change people and how they treat each other. This book is yet another reminder that in Utah, as in the rest of the nation, Black Americans could not, as they perhaps still cannot, depend upon the law in any fundamental sense. Thank you. I feel a little strange about this particular approach because they don't really have a chance to respond immediately to what I've just said. This you have afterwards. Fair enough. So now we'll move to the conversation portion. I will ask the panelists some questions and you will hear their responses. We're going to start with Alice. As someone who studies African American history in Utah, in the Mountain West, we want to hear your response to the book. What did you learn? How did new information bring prior knowledge into sharper focus?
I'm nervous, and so when I get nervous, my voice does go down. So if you can't hear me, let me know. It just means that I'm nervous.
I can't hear you.
Can't hear you.
But they heard you good enough to know that they can.
I thought this is an excellent book, and I'm grateful to Paul and Eugene and Chris for bringing forth this book to us. I really appreciate the work that they did to do so. As a volunteer with Utah's only Black History organization, I actually plan on creating an exhibit that will circulate the state of Utah using this book as a source, if Paul is okay with that. That one's down the road. I have other exhibits already in the queue. So what I learned a lot, and so I want to share my short list of what I learned with you, which might seem long. So I learned the different forms of slavery and what was and is termed unfree labor. I have always termed everything as slavery. And reading this book, it helped me to understand that there were back then some differences. And honestly, there are a lot of parallels to today as well. We just don't use those terms anymore. I learned the different forms of labor. Again, a lot of parallels to today that we don't consider. We think people are either paid or they volunteer. But I've worked for people, and I'm pretty sure I was indentured. It was a set time for me to go, and I never got anything out of it. So I'm pretty sure those still exist today too. I acquired a better understanding of apprenticeship and indentureship, especially those two. That really helped me to understand better what the Utah slave law was. That it was not, as Jordan said, a slave code like in the South. I learned the first official statement against Black Americans by LDS church leadership. Read it, had never heard it before, had never read it anywhere, read it in this book. A clear understanding of gradual emancipation, and that if it had been utilized, it would have been in the reconstruction our country needed to fully accept formerly enslaved persons into society as being humans and citizens. It is clear to me from reading this book that every form of gradual emancipation that was instituted in whatever state was not sufficient. If it had been sufficient, we would not be where we are right now in 2025. We would have been here maybe in 1905, and we would have been farther by now. I saw more clearly the descent of Brigham Young after Joseph died, that perhaps Joseph kept Brigham grounded and spiritually focused, and without him, Brigham lost that. Brigham went farther down a dark abyss of racism and disconnection, whereas Joseph, by the time he died, had grown to understand the necessity for emancipation, even gradual emancipation, which he actually encouraged when he ran for president, of giving Black Americans what all white American citizens had and letting Black Americans be afterwards. I acquired an understanding of why Brigham Young probably made the decisions he did regarding Indigenous people and Black Americans. And that understanding was possibly his background of being an apprentice and it being a harsh experience. Maybe he thought everybody needed that, or especially people who were not white American needed that. I understand better that Brigham Young stated he wanted to protect and take care of Indigenous people and Black Americans, that to him, the system he was setting in place was more of a paternalistic system than a harsh system. But from what I've read previously, it didn't work. And despite his zealousness to the gospel of Jesus Christ, he didn't see Black Americans or Indigenous people, whether enslaved or not, as real people. He said if a master harmed the person, there would be consequences. Yet there were owners who were members of the LDS Church who were cruel to their enslaved persons. Church leadership knew it. And church leadership, including those who held authoritative positions within the community, out in government, were aware of it. And none of them, including Brigham, ever did anything to stop them, to prevent them, or to remove those persons from those habitations. Short list.
Sounds like the book has a lot to teach us. Chris, for those unfamiliar with this history, can you briefly describe the different forms of slavery and unfree labor that existed in the region prior to 1852? And then explain what you believe the Utah legislature authorized for African American and Native American enslaved people.
So probably one thing I should start with is a couple times a number of people have used the term unfree labor. And that we're using that to distinguish various forms of labor from slavery. So I should probably talk about that for just a second. So unfree labor is a very large category. And within that category, you have a variety of different types of labor. And it's a spectrum. So on one end of the spectrum, you have chattel slavery, in which you have the ability to own another person as property. You own that person. And there may, in some cases, as Jordan was saying, in some of the Southern slave codes, there may at times be legal requirements about how you must care for those people, but at the bottom, those individuals are property with whom you can dispose of at your pleasure, essentially. Then you have various forms of servitude, and those can be very different depending on circumstances. They can include various terms of service, various amounts of liberty. They might include a wage in some cases, but essentially unfree labor is the idea that you do not have the ability to quit employment, that your master, whether you're an indentured servant or an enslaved person, has a legal right to your labor. And it may be that you've entered into some sort of a contract with the master for a particular period of time. It may not in the case of chattel slavery. So when we started looking at these situations and looking at the 19th century, we saw that there was a broad variety of forms of unfree labor that still existed in the United States, even in the northern states at this time, where they were moving away from chattel slavery, but you were in the midst of gradual emancipation. That's where Brigham Young and many of these people grew up, was in the North, particularly in New York, during gradual emancipation, where you could have African Americans in a variety of different legal statuses, from chattel slavery on the one hand to complete freedom on the other, and forms of servitude in between. So when the Latter-day Saints first came to Utah in 1847, we tend to think of the West as being a place of freedom. This is where people came to be free, to be able to start their farms and work on their own. And what it turns out is that there were a variety of forms of unfree labor in the West when Euro-Americans arrived, and certainly afterwards. So certainly among Native Americans, you had forms of enslavement. Typically speaking, equestrian tribes such as the Ute would take non-equestrian children and sometimes women from non-equestrian tribes, Paiute, Goshute, etc. And they would sell them into New Mexico, into California. And so you had this vast human trafficking network going along the old Spanish Trail and in other areas. And that long predated Latter-day Saints coming into the Salt Lake Valley. And it was something that they were soon drawn into. At the same time, you had white enslavers who came from the United States who would sometimes bring enslaved people with them, or who wanted laws that would protect slavery. And this was, in the South, there was this idea that they'd be able to spread slavery. Most people did not believe that you would ever have slavery in the West the way that you had it in the South. They just believed that the climate would not allow it. It was called the natural limits theory. We don't need to legislate about slavery in the West because no one's ever going to take slaves there because they can't set up plantations. It's just too dry. But we have, with Latter-day Saints, we have small numbers of Latter-day Saints from the South who bring enslaved people with them to what would become Utah territory. And so this then becomes a legal question. What is the status of these people once they arrive in Utah territory? And at the same time, if Latter-day Saints in their own minds redeem, is the word they would use, Native American children from Ute enslavers, and there's a lot to be unpacked there. What is their legal status? And I'll do this quickly because there's a big portion of the book that's about pre-1852. But at first, they did not want to pass any laws at all in regard to this. And there's a number of statements by leaders of the LDS hierarchy, including Brigham Young, in which they make clear that they do not believe that slavery is legal in Utah territory. And there's a couple different legal theories for that we don't need to touch on right now. But originally the idea is we don't need to pass laws. We will allow enslaved people to continue to live with their enslavers as long as they give some sort of, again, nominal consent. How that actually works in practice is a bit of a question mark. But that enslavers have no legal right to these people. They are not property. And what happens in late 1851 is there's a group of Spanish or New Mexican traders who come up from New Mexico, almost certainly to trade with the Ute people for enslaved Paiute children. They are arrested, they are prosecuted, not technically for the slave trade, but for trading with the Ute in violation of the Indian Intercourse Act. They are found guilty, the children are taken away, and they are returned to New Mexico. And it's at that point where Brigham Young looks at the situation. He has, at this point, not wanted to pass any legislation at all. And a large part of that was because what a fraught issue slavery was in the nation more generally. And his main political goal is to have Utah or Deseret enter the Union as a state. But at this point, having dealt with the New Mexicans, he decides that we need to finally put some laws on the books which will describe these relationships and what happens. And so, again, briefly, the Utah legislature in early 1852 begins deliberations on this. Brigham Young makes statements in January of 1852 in which he describes his idea of servitude. And he says pretty forthrightly, he does not want chattel slavery in Utah. And there can be a debate as to why he felt that was necessary. But he, at least in his statements, puts forward the opinion that that you cannot have slavery under a free government. That the idea of owning a person as property, I would argue he believes that to be both morally and legally wrong. That you cannot own somebody else. But he does put forward this idea of servitude, something in between immediate emancipation on one hand and continuing chattel slavery on the other. So the legislature ultimately, in a series of acts, creates a system whereby enslavers can still bring their enslaved people to Utah. Their legal status is changed from slave to servant. And on the one hand, I think it's very easy from a modern perspective to say, well, that's just a word. They, at least the legislators, believed they were doing something different. There are a series of arguments within the legislature about whether there is a true difference between servitude and slavery. And the vast majority of the legislatures say no. Servitude is one thing, slavery is another. And based on the current law within the United States and practice, they probably had the better point. At the same time, you had men like Orson Pratt, who, as Paul said, was looking forward to this free labor ethic that was continuing forward in the country. And his argument was, no, they are the same thing. That servitude and slavery are equivalent. That even though there may be changes, you can only hold native children for up to 20 years, still he calls that slavery for 20 years. And so this is one of the major arguments within the Utah legislature at this time is, what's the difference between servitude and slavery? Is there a difference? And most people genuinely believe that there was. And we go later in the book, and I think we'll talk about this, is from the perspective of the enslaved, they may have thought about them much differently. And that's something that we need to understand and we need to take seriously. But from the perspective of the legislators, this was not something that they were just doing to mask the fact that there was slavery in Utah. They did believe that they were creating something that was different. So they created forms of servitude for 3 groups of people specifically, for enslaved African Americans. Surprisingly, and this is something that we were able to find in the new documents, for Europeans, for Latter-day Saint converts coming from Europe who borrowed money either through the Perpetual Emigrating Fund or from private donors, and for Native American children. And that, as Paul mentioned, for Brigham Young and for many of these other people, they were recreating a system of labor that they had grown up with in New York and other places, where you still had forms of indentured servitude, you still had apprenticeship, you still had these intermediate forms of labor for African Americans. And so one way of looking at Utah's territory is essentially a recreation of the labor systems that existed in New York State in about 1820 or so. And partly that was a reaction to the economy. There's very little cash in Utah territory. Really, the only means of exchange is labor. Labor is everything. And so it's trying to create a system that both deals with those economic realities and is an attempt to not split the church over the question of slavery. While there are relatively few Southerners, relatively few pro-slavery Latter-day Saints, they do exist. And in the previous 2 decades, 3 major American denominations, the Baptists, the Presbyterians, and the Methodists, had all split over the question of slavery. And Brigham Young essentially says, not in my church. He wants everybody to live together, but forms this moderate solution to the problem. So
Thanks, Chris. I think this is, as I've indicated, one of the great contributions to the book. I think it does break apart that binary of slavery. It shows that it's much more complicated. You mentioned Orson Pratt, so you'll take us to our next question for Paul. Orson Pratt is the one who says this abominable slavery. I don't always, I'm usually pretty eager to claim descent from Orson Pratt. I'm actually descended from Orson Pratt, but especially in this conversation, I will point that out. But could you tell us a little bit more about Orson Pratt? Could you tell us about the context of that statement? Maybe this will give us a chance to talk about other statements he later makes and maybe the election bill, perhaps?
Sure. So Orson Pratt, territorial legislator, Latter-day Saint apostle, also grew up in New York. He comes to believe that all forms of unfree labor are slavery. So he will propose that the act in relation to service be rejected outright. He does not want slavery introduced in any form in Utah territory. The Native American indenture bill, which allows for indenture for up to 20 years. He also calls slavery for 20 years. So he's equating both forms of unfree labor to slavery. He represents that free labor ethic sweeping in across the nation. He also is proposing in the debate over the election bill that Utah allow Black men the right to vote in 1852. This then is Orson Pratt representing a free labor ethic as well as a notion that Black people are equal. He calls Black people innocent. Brigham Young defines them as racially cursed. So you have those two things playing out theologically as well as politically in Utah territory. So he says we should not introduce slavery into this territory. He says it's enough to cause the angels in heaven to blush and promote Black male voting rights. Brigham Young will respond in that 5th of February speech where he simply says we just as well give mules the right to vote as Negroes and Indians. Understanding that there's a debate over the election bill as well as these two serving codes helps you to understand what Brigham Young is saying. And he is advocating that Black people, Native Americans, people from Mexico, people from Asia, only white people be allowed to vote in Utah Territory, but saying that they can all be counted as citizens, but voting rights should be preserved to white people. So Orson Pratt is representing that free labor ethic and also Black male voting rights in 1852, which is atypical even for the nation in the 1850s. And you have this profound debate that takes place. Brigham Young and Orson Pratt are butting heads, and you see it repeated in this legislative session. So the Native American Indenture Bill, Orson Pratt says we have a humanitarian obligation to respond when Native children are brought to us by youth traffickers, but we should do so out of a humanitarian impulse, not with an indenture bill that allows them to be indentured for up to 20 years. That kind of is a nutshell of Orson Pratt's perspective.
Good. I'd just like to interject the documents that have surfaced and the Gene Carruth transcribed. These are so useful. It's remarkable. I get to stand up in my class and say, most historians have not read these documents, right? And now they get to read this debate between Brigham Young and Orson Pratt and get to think about the complexity of these issues. So it's quite amazing to have those. Yes.
The next question. I'm really surprised that you didn't share Orson Pratt's speech when he was called as the second one to talk or testify, because I love that. I love what he says. And if you don't buy this book for any other reason, buy it to read what Orson Pratt says, because I need to know if anybody else hears Mark Anthony from Shakespeare's from his speech. I just need to know, because
And all these speeches can be found on a website, This Abominable Slavery, right?
Thisabominableslavery.org. So in 1856, what Alice is referring to, in 1856, Orson Pratt will say we have no proof that Africans are descendants of, cursed descendants of Cain, right? That's Brigham Young's only justification for a racial priesthood and temple restriction in the LDS faith. And Orson Pratt rejects that explanation outright. Remember, he's defining people of African descent as inherently innocent. Brigham Young, in his racial priesthood and temple restrictions, defines them as cursed, sets up a violation of a founding principle of the Latter-day Saint faith. Joseph Smith says Latter-day Saints, people are accountable for their own sins, not for Adam's transgression. Brigham Young yet is holding the supposed descendants of Cain accountable for a murder in which they took no part. And Orson Pratt rejects that. And that's his 1856 speech that Alice is referring to. And it's so you have two fantastic anti-slavery speeches from Orson Pratt.
can I just read it?
You have another speech in mind?
This is the one that I'm referring to, when he stands before the legislature and he says, I'm going to read this paragraph. Wait, where is he?
So that's the
Yeah.
January 1852 speech.
Yeah.
Okay.
And he says, it is buying and selling, though it may not continue down through other generations, yet it is binding the Indians to slavery for at least 20 years. Pratt told the council forthwithly that when we touch the principle of enslaving the Aborigines of this country, binding them by certain laws to be bought and sold, it is preposterous, and I wonder why any gentleman present would bring such a bill. Do you not hear, Mark Anthony? This was
An honorable?
an honorable man. Wow. You just hear him.
Okay, Alice, actually, the next question is for you. You are an officer in the Samahaditi Foundation. I don't know if I said that right. The name of which means tell the story in Swahili. Story of slavery is difficult, to put it mildly, and some people suggest that dredging up such unpleasant aspects of the past only leads to division in the present. So, should we, in fact, tell the story of slavery in Utah, and why not?
Yeah. We have to tell the story of slavery, not just in Utah, but in our country for a lot of reasons. So a lot of them are brought out in this book. I want to share just two. One is lifespan. So during the time period that we're talking about, say, even if a person was in, because to me that is still slavery. I'm with Orson Pratt on that, even though that brother went the long way. Say you're held for 30 years. Let's say you're held for 30 years, and well, actually, they usually set an age for gradual emancipation, which would be like about 34 years old. Okay, you're held until you're 34 years old. At that time period, the typical lifespan for somebody would have been until they were maybe about 50. How many years does that give you to live free? To live not being enslaved? How many is that?
16.
16. Can you imagine only having 16 years of your life to do what goals you want to do, to achieve what you want to do? Can you imagine that? Only 16 years? Slavery teaches us that. The other thing is the question, and Paul approached this, is he said, he talked about, it might have been Chris, can human beings be held as slaves? And yes, human beings can be held as slaves. With the power, the authority, and the law on your side, you can enslave other humans. The question isn't, can human beings be held as slaves, which we need to discuss. It is, should human beings be held as slaves? And no, they should not be. And there's a whole list of reasons why human beings, regardless of who that human being is, should not be held as slaves. I think it's an important discussion. There's a lot in our organization, Samadithi Foundation. We get told a lot because we focus on Black history in Utah. Well, you say it's American history. Why don't you take the Black off that and just share history, period, of Utah? Well, that is well and good. But one reason why we do it the way we should is because, yes, Black American history, Black history of the Black African diaspora. That's all those people who started in Africa and then moved out, okay? Haitians, Jamaicans, everybody. That history is important to be told. What makes it American history is not that, to me, is not that it happened here on this soil, but it's that here on this soil, we have all these different people coming together. We have Asians and we have Pacific Islanders, we have Haitians and Black Americans whose ancestry goes back to slavery. And we have all these people coming together. And when you read a story and it's only told from one perspective, and in this case of slavery, from a white American perspective, that's an important perspective to have. And it's important that we read that and that we learn that. But then we read it from another perspective, or we hear it from another perspective, a Black American perspective, whose ancestry is in the Geechee culture, in the Carolinas, in Georgia, along the Gulf Coast. Because the Geechee people, the Geechee Gullah people, are the only ones who can actually trace their ancestry directly back, because they kept that original language that was brought to them out of enslavement. Their people, when all the enslaved people were brought together, they came together with different languages, and they had to come up with a way to communicate. And they had to create a whole new culture because the culture they had was left behind on another continent. They had to come up with a language because they were told to not speak their native language from another country, another continent. And so they created a language that they spoke among themselves. And that language that they spoke, which is Geechee, they brought with them out of enslavement. And those descendants, even many today, still speak Geechee. There is a Bible that they read, and that the last Geechee minister would preach from in was it North Carolina? No, South Carolina. In South Carolina, and it's written in Geechee. And when you read it, it sounds foreign to your ears, but if you read it out loud, you understand very well what they're saying and what's being talked about. It's important to hear history from all these different perspectives. And so it's important that we talk about slavery, about the people who were enslaved, and about the people who did the enslaving. Because by talking about it and from getting different perspectives, a historian, a lawyer, a BYU person, honest person, you get all these different perspectives, and then from getting all those different perspectives, there's the possibility of greater understanding coming. I want to give you a visual illustration of this to help you understand a little bit better. Lucille Ball. I think everybody in here knows who Lucille Ball is. If you don't, raise your hand. Get out your phone and look her up. She is an iconic comedian, but more than that, she was just an incredible inventor, actress. And one of the things that she did when she worked on the set of I Love Lucy is she tired of repeating a scene again and again. So the camera that was here caught her profile. And then the camera moved to here to catch her in front. And then it moved to this other side to catch her here. She had to repeat the scene multitudinous of times. And she tired of that. And she said, okay, this is what we're going to do. We're going to place a camera here. We're going to place one there. We're going to place one directly in front of me. And we're going to place one over here. And you're going to roll simultaneously. I'm going to do the scene once. Every camera is going to get it. And then you're going to edit. You're going to edit that scene once you get to the editing floor. Lucille Ball created that. That's what perspective is. Each one of those cameras are different perspectives. And when we bring all those cameras together into one scene, we see what Lucille Ball saw, which was, it's not repeated. It's, oh, look at that. Look how that is from that perspective. Look how it is from there. And we get a more rounded, we get a fuller perspective of the issue. Slavery has to be discussed. We have to discuss it together, because when we come together to discuss difficult topics, we realize as we start talking about them, they're really not so difficult to discuss. There's this thing called fear, and it's always right behind us and ready to reach out and to grab us. And as it's about to do so, we think, yeah, I'm not going to do that. Okay, like me coming here today. Yeah, I'm not going there today. I'm too scared to do this one today. Yeah, there are going to be way too many people. And if we allow fear to win, then what happens is that we remain disconnected. Not just disconnected from the truth of history, the truth of one another, but we remain disconnected from one another. The whole plan, the whole purpose is for us to come here to this earth and to learn to become connected one to another. Our differences, we may not always like what everybody's differences are, right? There are women who dress so much better than I do, and I so admire them for that. The difference is I don't dress like that. I dress like this. There are men who wear hats all the time and suits all the time, and there are some men who don't. They wear more leisure suits and and shirts that hang out and nice looking sneakers. But differences, whatever they are, whatever it is, that the food we eat, the way we dress, how we live, what we choose, those differences make us stronger. They don't weaken us, they make us stronger. And not getting into politics, but what we're experiencing right now is a good example. Will we be made stronger or will we be made weaker from it? And the thing that makes us comfortable with one another are our samenesses, right? I'm comfortable with Paul because I've known him for a long time. His spirit just feels like a brother to me. And so I'm comfortable with him. There are some samenesses that we have getting to know Chris. There are samenesses that we have. One sameness immediately is that Chris lacks hair. And I think that bald men are very handsome. And I mean, Jean-Luc Picard, and Ving Rhames, handsome men. But these samenesses help us to be comfortable with one another, while our differences help us to be stronger. We must discuss the hard topics, whatever they are. Otherwise, we fall prey to fear. And if that's what we want to do, then we are in that moment beginning our own self-destruction and the destruction of our community and our society every time we do that.
All right, are we done? Okay, wonderful.
We're
Thank you.
done?
Great. We're done. You ended us on a high note. I think we're there. Please join me in congratulating our authors and panelists.